Hello and welcome to Talking Open for Climate Justice, a limited-run podcast series created by Western Michigan University Libraries. I'm your host, Sarah Volmering, and this week we're shining a light on open access and how it helps foster solutions for some of the greatest challenges facing our planet. So far in this series, we've explored climate justice with an interdisciplinary approach. Today's guests, Michele Behr and Daria Orlowska, will focus on open access, what it is, how to find it, and why it's important to not only climate justice, but other global issues. Michele Behr is the Scholarly Communications and Open Educational Resources Librarian at Western Michigan University Libraries. She educates and consults with researchers on their options for disseminating their research, including open access publishing. Daria Orlowska is the data librarian at Western Michigan University Libraries, where she consults and supports researchers to help them find and manage their research data. Welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. It's nice to see you.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Before we jump into open access, I wanted to ask a question we've asked all our guests so far. What does climate justice mean to you?
So, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm just kind of a random citizen and a librarian. So I think from my perspective, climate justice has to do with two things. First of all, the climate change, the problem of climate change that we have going on. And then justice, I think, alludes to the fact that climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. So there are certain populations, people in certain places that are more impacted by the problem with climate change. And those people haven't equally contributed to the problem. So it's sort of maddening that a lot of those people who didn't really contribute to anything are really suffering. And also, I think there's also very related phrase, which is environmental justice. So I think that's, here in Michigan, I think we've talked more about environmental justice with things like the Flint water crisis and other things like that. So I think climate justice and environmental justice are related. But I think my perspective, I was just so glad that they picked this topic for International Access Week, because I think those are topics, the climate justice are topics that are super pertinent to open access, because everybody has a vested interest in improving the situation with climate change. So I think that, having open access so everybody has access to that information is really important if we're going to make improvements in the situation.
I agree with everything Michele has said so far. I just can add that, we are living in the Midwest, which is a relatively sheltered area, right? Like we have the Great Lakes and we're not on either coast. And so we feel some of the climate change here in terms of, rising temperatures during the summer, colder temperatures in the winter. But if you look around the country, we have a lot of flooding, we have wildfires, and the people who are disproportionately affected by that are, people who are from marginalized populations. It could be Indigenous or First Nation people who are living on land that is experiencing flooding or is going away because it's by the coast, right? And they're kind of locked into this area. Or you have low-income families who, because of drought, might have a harder time acquiring fresh produce. So the effects of it are, like Michele said, it's not being felt equally across the population. And depending where you're living and what your circumstances are, how young you are as well, right? Because the younger generation that's coming in, they're kind of inheriting this situation. And so they have to deal with it as well in the future. So it's important to talk about this topic and, what are things that we can change moving forward to address it right now.
Let's dive into open access. What is open access and why should we care about it?
The word open is, sort of becoming more pervasive with regard to all kinds of areas of research, open science, open education. And so open access really refers more specifically to the publication aspect of research. People around here at Western are probably aware that, there are certain journals, certain conference proceedings and things that you have to purchase. And so, one of the things that can be frustrating to people when they go to internet search on a topic of maybe personal interest or something for a course that they're taking, is that they can't get access to the journal that they want. Like, oh, I can see the abstract, but I can't read the actual text of the article that I really would like to read or need to read. And so the idea of open access is, removes that. So instead of having, the sort of the model that we have now is, we as a library purchase these things, and people who have, credentials, who are affiliated with Western can have access to those. So if you're not affiliated with the university, or maybe you're affiliated with a university that doesn't have a very good budget and doesn't have a lot of access, doesn't have a lot of journal subscriptions or databases, then you're really out of luck. And so I think, going back to this climate justice topic, I think that the open, like I said, the open access aspect of this, I think, is so important because there are so many people who would really like to know more about the research that's going on. I think some people sort of started to pay attention with regard to COVID because there was so much research that was sharing, and there was such an urgency about having to share that information about, somebody did a study and somebody else really wants to build on that study to try to figure out, where is this coming from? How can we cure it? What are the symptoms? And so I think that was really, maybe eye-opening for some people around why open access is important, because when you have any area of research, the more we have access, if you're researching something without having access to everything means, you could be missing something. So, we're moving toward open access. There are lots of developments toward open access, but we're not, it's not a perfect world of open access, but educating people and advocating for open access is really, something that we're putting a lot of energy into right now.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that during COVID, like Michele was saying, that a lot of researchers were releasing preprints. So they wrote an article, and instead of waiting until the journal published it, they would release it as a manuscript pre-publication on different websites that was freely accessible to everyone. And that allowed other researchers to be like, okay, what are other people finding? What are the developments? What can we build on? And it allowed for a more reactive sort of conversation that advanced research pretty quickly. And so when we talk about open access, we don't necessarily always mean the gold open access standard for publishing. That's when researchers go into the publisher and have to pay an extra fee in order to make their work available to everyone without a paywall. It can also mean green open access, which is posting your preprints, your articles into your institutional repository or into other repositories like PubMed or archive for the different sciences that would also make it readily available for other researchers to find. So there's a lot of ways that you can go about thinking about open access, not just, oh, it's a burden on researchers having to pay extra fees to make this open.
What's the background of open access publishing? When would you say that the idea of it got started?
It certainly has been around for a while that people have this frustration of not being able to have access to research that they want to have access to. I don't know. I would say probably it's been more of an issue. It's been more of a, something that a problem people are trying to solve probably in the last 10 to 15 years. There's been lots of activity and consortia coming together to, try to provide open access. So as Daria said, there are costs associated with publishing. So you can't, in order to publish a journal, there are costs associated with the copy editing and the indexing and the table of contents and the peer review process. So with the open access model, now somebody has to pay those costs. So if I really want my article to be open access because I really want to share it out in the world, as the author, I would have to pay those fees. So that's kind of how it works now, which is, not ideal. And, something that we deal with a lot around here because people want to publish open access, but they don't have the money. Some of these publisher fees are pretty high. So part of the, kind of the movement is, how can we, make this commercially viable? How can we make publication something that, people will still want to do without having to pay a lot of fees?
When I think of the history of open access, I kind of think back to the White House Office of Science and Technology policy memo that was released in 2013. And that was the really big one that kind of started having people think about these issues more concretely because it mandated that funding agencies with a research budget of over 100 million had to develop a plan to figure out how they were going to do things, how they were going to make research as publicly accessible as possible. That was, of course, federally grant funded, right? This doesn't include private entities, but they talked a lot about, okay, well, if it's an article that you're publishing, you need to go ahead and make it available as soon as possible. And you can instate a 12-month embargo, but that's kind of what the limit is unless you negotiate something else. And if you have underlying research data, then you really should be releasing that too, because a lot of the times the research data is good in order to figure out like what the researcher did and in order to replicate the research to make it more transparent. So that was the first one in 2013. And then we just had another one that came out in August 2022, and it kind of expanded on that initial memo. So it said you are no longer able to have a 12-month embargo. Really, if you're publishing research in terms of articles, and not just articles, but also book chapters, conference proceedings, all of that needs to go out as soon as possible. And it also said, okay, well, we wanted you to put out your research data, but we also want it to be in like a machine readable format so that it's very easy to find. So really making sure that they're putting in all the necessary information like funding and identifiers, such as ORCID IDs that identify the researcher, but also DOIs, which are digital object identifiers for the data set and for the article to link everything together to make it as findable as possible.
So yeah, I think that's a really good point. 2013, as she mentioned, was sort of one of those kind of milestone things with this memo that came out from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So there are a couple things that I just kind of wanted to emphasize about that. One is that it's taxpayer funded. So that's part of the motivation of this, is that so much of this research is funded from your taxes and my taxes. And so the idea being that so we should share. So, if you're funding it, you ought to be able to read it in its final form. So I think that that sort of milestone that came out in 2013, and then again, the more recent update, the sort of revision that came out in 2022. So first of all, the kind of transparency of this is what your tax dollars are paying for, and also I also really appreciate the kind of the accountability of it, that you can see what people did. And then if you wanted to build on it, you wanted to read it, share it with somebody else. So, kind of the transparency, accountability of that, as well as the open access. So, this is that people have access to it to do whatever they want with. And so, the data that Daria was talking about. So, I do a study on whatever it is. And this is all subjects. So it's humanities, it's physics, it's medicine, all subjects. So so that you could even, take the data set that somebody compiled for something else and you want to do some other analysis on it, or you want to add it to another data set that you have. So all of that is machine readable. And then again, like she said, this most recent memo that just came out at the end of August says that all federal agencies have to figure out a plan to do this. So there's still a lot of questions about how this is actually going to work. Like all of these things that come out, it sounds great, but it takes a while for plans to be in place to actually make it work. So that will be unfolding. But the idea is, that any federally funded research has to be open access. So there's, so which I think to me is a really good sign and a really good movement toward open access in general.
What do you think are the global impacts of those decisions that were made in the US but could have implications for researchers around the world?
So I think, if we use this climate justice as a, kind of an example, I think to me, one of the things about, so I think this is just sort of one step, that U.S. federally funded research is shared broadly. But I think it's particularly important with regard to this climate justice because I think it really empowers people. It really empowers them. Could be that you You want to organize around a topic. You want to put other people together around, some issue with the climate or with the environment. Maybe you want to apply for a grant. Maybe you want to do something like that. And so it really empowers you. Before you were really limited in terms of what research you had access to build a case, or to provide evidence, or to say, okay, so these people have done this kind of research. We want to do this other kind of research, and try to solve this problem. And we're going to build on the data that's already been done because we have access to it. So I think, again, this is just one step. There's so much more to be done, but I think it's really a movement in the right direction. And I think it's really helpful toward helping us solve some of these problems, like with the climate and like with COVID. And there's so many, kind of problems in society that need multiple, approaches to help us improve the situation.
We talked a little bit about climate justice and how it doesn't affect everyone equally. And same with like open access and publishing in journals that have paywalls, right? You have researchers who are in countries that are low income or who are just starting out and can't pay these fees, or practitioners like medical doctors who aren't affiliated with institutions who don't have access. And so making sure that your federally funded research, which there's a lot of money there, right, is actually publicly accessible to everyone and not just people who can afford it is really important.
Join us for part 2 of this interview with Michele and Daria in the next episode. Thank you for listening to Talking Open for Climate Justice, a podcast created by Western Michigan University Libraries for International Open Access Week. For more information about open access, visit our website, wmich.edu/library/open-access.